Mael had been lying in the East Valley for 3 days when Reva found
I'm here to
him.
help, Mael.
She had not been looking for a dragon. She had been taking the long route between the village of Kale and the mountain settlement at Hearn's Pass, the route that went through the East Valley, because the East Valley path was better for the mule, and the mule was carrying everything she owned that mattered, which was her medicine chest and her grandmother's notebooks. She had not been expecting the valley to be occupied. Mael was hard to miss. He was large in the way that very old dragons are large, which is different from the way simply big dragons are large. He had mass that seemed to extend beyond his physical edges, a presence that changed the quality of the space around him. He was the color of old bronze, and he was lying on his side, which was wrong. Dragons did not lie on their sides. They rested on their stomachs or their haunches. Lying on the side was something else. Reva stopped the mule at the valley entrance and looked. She could see from this distance that Mael was breathing. The breathing was visible in the slow rise and fall of his ribcage, but the breathing was too shallow and too fast for an animal his size, and that combination, shallow and fast, was something her grandmother had described in a specific passage in the third notebook. Her grandmother had written, "In a large creature, shallow, rapid breathing that persists beyond initial distress indicates deep systemic involvement. Something is wrong at the core." Reva tied the mule to a rock. She took the medicine chest and the third notebook. She walked into the valley. Mael opened one eye when she was 30 feet away. The eye was the color of old amber, and it was very large, and it tracked her with the particular attention of something that is in pain, but still alert. Reva stopped. She looked at the eye. She said, "I can see you are hurt. I am going to come closer and look at the wound. I am not going to do anything you do not allow." She had said this, or something like it, to many creatures over the years. Most of them did not respond in a way that could be identified as response. Mael lowered his eyes slightly. She took this as permission and continued walking. Reva had been a healer for 8 years. She had not been trained at one of the formal healing academies. She had been trained by her grandmother Sita, who had spent 40 years traveling the Eastern Territories with a medicine chest and 3 notebooks, and the considered opinion that most healing was observation, followed by correct action, and that anyone who told you it was more complicated than that was probably trying to sell you something. Sita had died 4 years ago at the age of 81, in the middle of a field, which was where she had always said she wanted to go. She had spent the last 3 years of her life giving her notebooks to Reva, one at a time, going through each one and explaining the passages that were abbreviated or in the personal shorthand she had developed over decades of note-taking. The third notebook, which Reva was carrying now, was the one about large animals, which Sita had defined as anything bigger than a horse. It included 2 sections on dragons. Sita had treated dragons 3 times in her career. She had not sought out dragon patients. They had found her, or been brought to her, on 3 separate occasions when no one else was available. She had treated them with the same approach she used for everything else. Observe carefully, identify the actual problem rather than the visible symptom, do the indicated thing, and do not be afraid of scale. The sections on dragons in the third notebook were precise and practical, written in full sentences rather than Sita's usual compressed shorthand, which meant Sita had considered them important enough to write out clearly. Reva had read them many times. She had not expected to need them. She had been wrong about this, which was a category of error Seta had also warned her about. She reached Mael's side and set down the medicine chest. She put the notebook on top of it. She began her assessment from the front, working backward the way the third notebook specified. She checked his eye response, which was present but slow. She checked his nostril color, which was pale at the edges. She checked his skin temperature at the jaw and the neck. She checked his breathing rate. She wrote the numbers in the blank pages at the back of the notebook while she counted. Then she found the wound. It was on his left flank, deep in the angle where the wing attached to the body, in the place that was hardest to reach and hardest to see. It was an arrow wound. The arrow had been removed, but not recently. The wound had been cleaned once and then left, and in the time since it had been left, it had developed the specific deep redness that her grandmother had described as bone-adjacent inflammation, indicates involvement below the muscle layer. This category of wound required particular handling. Reva said, quietly, to Mael's eye, "This is a serious wound. I am going to need several hours. I need you to stay still." The eye tracked to her, held there. She opened the medicine chest and went to work. 3 days north of the East Valley, in the palace of the Caliph Highlands, Emperor Sorin was dying. He did not know this was the word for what was happening to him. His physicians had not used this word. They had used words like bond fatigue and systemic resonance disruption and empathic transfer complications, which were precise clinical terms that avoided the simpler word by surrounding it with enough complexity that no one had to say it directly. Sorin was 29 years old. He had been bonded to Mael since he was 13, which was young for a bonding even by the standards of his family, who had been bonded to dragon lines for 4 generations. 16 years of bond meant that what Mael felt, Sorin felt in the attenuated way of bond transmission. Not fully, not immediately, but persistently, the way background noise becomes part of the environment until the noise stops and you notice the silence. Mael's wound was 3 days old. In those 3 days, Sorin had progressively lost his appetite, then his ability to maintain full concentration, then his ability to stay awake for the full day. He was sleeping 14 hours and waking exhausted. His hands had the faint tremor that his physicians associated with bond distress. He was eating when they brought food but not tasting it. His chief physician had told him, "Rest, stay calm, give the bond time to rebalance." This advice assumed that Mael would heal. The physician did not know where Mael had gone after the assassination attempt. No one knew. Mael had taken the arrow during the attack and had immediately flown east, which was what Mael always did when he was badly hurt. He went east, and he found a place to heal alone, and he did not return until he was ready. This had happened twice before, in minor injuries, and both times he had come back in 4 or 5 days. The physician was confident. Sorin was not confident. He could feel, through the bond's attenuated channel, that this was different from the minor injuries. The connection between them had the quality of something being stretched very thin. Not broken, but thin. He sat in his chair by the window and looked at the highland sky, and thought about Mael. He thought about the specific weight of Mael on a flight, the particular turbulence he created, the way the wind hit you differently when you were that high up on a dragon that large. He thought about Mael's amber eye and the quality of attention in it, which had been the first thing he had noticed when they met, which had not changed in 16 years. He thought, hold on, he directed this at the bond's thin channel, uncertain whether it transmitted. Hold on. Rumi wrote, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." The bond between Sorin and Mael was something like that field. It existed outside the official categories. It was not contractual, not transactional, not a tool of governance. It was simply the space between 2 living things that had chosen each other and had been choosing each other daily for 16 years. Sorin directed his thought at the thin channel again. Hold on, I am coming. He stood up. He told his chamberlain to find him a horse. Reva worked for 6 hours without stopping. The wound required draining, which required the specific angled instrument her grandmother had designed and described in the 3rd notebook, with measurements precise enough that Reva had been able to recreate it. The drainage produced material that confirmed the bone-adjacent inflammation assessment. After drainage, the wound required cleaning with a particular solution that Reva compounded from the medicine chest while Mael lay still and watched her with the amber eye. Mael was very good at staying still. This surprised her a little. She had expected a creature in this much pain to be more difficult. But Mael lay as steady as old stone through the entire drainage process, which took an hour and a half and was not comfortable. He breathed. His eye tracked her. When she told him what she was doing next, the eye tracked to her face for a moment, before returning to what she was working on, and she took this as acknowledgement. Between the drainage and the cleaning, there was a period where she needed to wait for the compound to reach its working temperature, and she sat on a rock near his jaw, and drank water and said, "You are doing very well. I know this is a long process." His eye moved to her. "Held there," she said. I should tell you that I have not treated a dragon before. I have treated many other things. My grandmother treated dragons 3 times, and wrote down everything she did. I have her notes. I have followed them carefully. I believe the wound is manageable if we are thorough. The eye held. She said, I am going to keep talking, because I think it helps you stay calm, and it helps me stay focused, so you will have to tolerate that. She was not sure why she was explaining herself to a dragon. She had always explained herself to her patients, even the ones who could not understand her, because her grandmother had said, it does not matter if they understand the words. The tone carries information that words do not. If you are calm and direct, they feel calm and direct. If you are uncertain, they feel uncertain. She was calm. She was direct. She talked through the entire process. There was a particular passage in Seta's notebook that Reva had read many times without being certain she fully understood it until now. Seta had written, the large patient requires the practitioner to be more present, not less. The size of the patient does not diminish the requirement for contact and communication, it amplifies it. A large animal that has decided to tolerate your presence is giving you something substantial. Treat it as such. Reva treated it as such. She talked and she worked, and she was entirely present for 6 consecutive hours, which was the most sustained presence she had been asked to give since a complicated birth at the mountain settlement the previous spring. By the 6th hour, the wound was cleaned, treated, and dressed with the poultice the notebook specified for deep inflammation. She had used nearly everything in that section of the medicine chest. She sat back and looked at Mael's flank and thought about what she had done and whether she had done it correctly. Mael exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale, different from the shallow, rapid breathing she had found. She wrote the new breathing rate in the notebook. It was better. Not normal yet, but moving in the correct direction. She said, there. He made a sound, low and sustained, from deep in his chest. She sat on the rock beside his jaw and listened to it, and felt, for the first time in 6 hours, the particular tiredness that came after intense sustained work. Not bad, just full. She was full of the work, and the concentration, and the 6 hours of being entirely present with a creature in pain. She said, rest. I will check you in the morning. Sorin reached the East Valley at the edge of dark. He had ridden hard for 3 days, which was faster than recommended for a man in his current condition, which was the condition of someone whose bond was transmitting ongoing distress in the attenuated way of a very stretched connection. But riding hard was better than staying still. Staying still made the condition more noticeable. He rode. He found the valley entrance and stopped his horse. He could feel, through the bond channel, that something had changed in the last 6 hours. The quality of Mael's signal was different from what it had been for 3 days. It was less strained, not fully recovered but less strained, in the way of someone who has been carrying something very heavy and has set it down for the first time. He came down into the valley in the last of the light. He found Mael first. Mael was still on his side, but his breathing was visible at 30 feet, and it was better than Sorin had expected to find. Sorin stood next to Mael's head and put his hand on the scales behind the jaw, which was the place Mael had always oriented toward when Sorin was near. Through the hand and through the bond, he felt what Mael felt, the particular tiredness of an animal after a long medical procedure, and underneath the tiredness, something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. Sorin said, "All right, I am here." He said it quietly. He had been saying it, through the bond, for 3 days. Then he heard a sound from nearby and turned. Reva was sitting on a rock 8 feet away. She had a notebook open on her knee, and was writing something by lantern light. She looked up when Sorin turned. She looked at him. She looked at his face, which had the specific gray quality of someone who had not been eating enough for 3 days. She looked at the bond mark on his wrist, which was the visible trace that bonded pairs always carried, a faint luminescence at the skin that corresponded to the dragon's scale color. His was the amber bronze of Mael's scales. She said, "You are the bond partner." He said, "Yes." She said, "Sit down. You look worse than he does." Sorin sat on a second rock near the lantern and listened while Reva described what she had found and what she had done. She described it the way she described everything, methodically, in order, without sparing detail. The wound location, the drainage findings, the compound she had used, the poultice. She showed him the third notebook open to the relevant pages, pointing to each step and confirming what she had done against what was written. She told him the breathing rate before and after. She told him what to expect in the next 3 days. Sorin listened carefully. He was a precise man by nature and by training, and he processed information the same way Reva delivered it, methodically, checking each piece against what he already knew. What he knew about Mael's physiology came from 16 years of bond knowledge rather than clinical study, which was a different kind of knowing, less organized but deeper. He found that Reva's clinical account aligned with what the bond had been telling him, translated from sensation into language. He said, "When you found him, how was the wound?" Reva said, 3 days old and inadequately managed. Whoever removed the arrow did the removal correctly, but did not address the secondary inflammation. At the stage I found it, without intervention, the prognosis within another 48 hours would have been poor. Sorin said, "Poor?" Reva said, directly, "Poor means he would likely have died." The valley was very quiet. Sorin looked at Mael's flank, where the poultice was visible in the lantern light. He said, "You did not know who he was when you found him." Reva said, "I knew he was a badly injured dragon." He said, "You did not know he was the Emperor's bonded dragon." Reva said, "I knew he was someone's bonded dragon. The scale luminescence pattern is distinctive in bonded adults, but I did not know whose." He said, "Does it change what you would have done?" She considered this. She said, "No." Sorin looked at her. She was matter-of-fact in the way of someone who has been in difficult situations many times and has found that directness is more useful than ceremony. She was tired, the particular tired of someone who has done sustained careful work and is now in the aftermath of it, but she was not letting the tiredness affect her clarity. He said, "What do you need to continue treating him?" She said, 3 more days minimum. I have enough supplies for the follow-up treatment. What I need is for him to stay still and for you to eat something because bond distress on an empty stomach is significantly harder to manage, and I cannot treat 2 patients at once." He almost smiled. He was not quite in a condition to smile fully. He said, "There is food in my saddlebag." She said, "I will get it." Reva had not intended to stay 3 days. She had intended to check Mael in the morning and continue to Hearn's Pass. But the morning check showed that the wound was responding well and needed consistent monitoring, which meant staying, and the Emperor was in a state that also needed monitoring, and monitoring 2 patients at once in a valley, with no other help available, was simply the situation she was in. She stayed. The 3 days had a rhythm. She checked Mael in the early morning and the evening. She changed the poultice on the 2nd day. She tracked the breathing rate in the notebook. Mael was improving at approximately the pace the 3rd notebook suggested he would, which made her feel that Sita's documentation was, as Sita had always claimed it to be, accurate. Sorin she fed at every meal and made sleep when he was not needed for anything. The bond distress symptoms improved as Mael improved, which was the expected direction. By the 2nd day his color was better. By the 3rd his hands were steady. They talked, during those 3 days, not about anything planned. The way people talk when they are together in a specific situation with no particular escape from each other, about the things that are in their heads. Sorin talked about Mael, about the first day of the bond, when he had been 13 and Mael had been older than his family's entire recorded history. About the specific quality of the bond at high altitude when they were flying in the kind of weather that most dragons grounded for, and Mael chose to stay up. About the 16 years of it, which were not all good but were all his in a way that nothing else was. Reva talked about Seta, about the 40 years of notebooks she had inherited and was still working through, about the particular problem of treating patients who could not tell you directly what hurt, which was most of her patients, and what you learned about attention and inference from years of that kind of practice. They talked about what Reva was doing on the East Valley path. They talked about Hearn's Pass and the people there, and the winter supply situation. They talked about how the road between Kale and Hearn's Pass had changed in the last few years, and which sections were difficult in rain. They talked about Seda's notebooks and what parts of them were still beyond Reva's experience to confirm, which was most of the sections on ocean animals, and a few of the passages on the larger land predators. They talked about the things you talked about when you were in a valley for 3 days with a healing dragon, and no particular ceremony, the ordinary matters of the lives you were each living, the ones you did not usually narrate because there was no one to narrate them to. On the third evening, Mael stood up. He did it slowly and with effort, testing his weight on each leg before committing. Reva watched from the side and checked his breathing while he moved. He stood. He turned his head toward Reva and lowered it to her level and held it there. She put her hand on his jaw the way she had been doing during treatment. She said, "Good. Very good." Sorin watched Reva with Mael on the third evening, and felt through the bond something that was not information about Mael's physical condition, but something else. The bond did not only transmit physical sensation. This was something the clinical descriptions of bonding never quite captured adequately. The bond transmitted emotional states too, at a lower resolution than sensation, more like a general quality than a specific content. What Sorin felt from Mael on the third evening was something he associated with the dragon's rare expressions of what might be called comfort. The specific comfort of being in a known space with something known. Mael found Reva known. After 3 days and the specific hours of her treatment, and her voice and her calm, and her talking through the process, Mael had incorporated Reva into the category of things that were safe. This was not a category Mael extended easily. After 16 years of bond, Mael had extended it to Sorin and to one elderly stable master at the palace who had cared for Mael for 30 years. He had now extended it to a field healer he had known for 3 days. Sorin thought about what Reva had done. In those 3 days, she had approached the wound directly. She had described each step before she did it. She had talked through the process to keep the patient calm and herself focused. She had eaten the food she had made him eat, and slept the hours she had made him sleep. She had applied her grandmother's knowledge with the specific care of someone who had inherited something they intended to honor. She had not treated Mael differently once she understood whose dragon he was. This was the thing Sorin kept returning to. She had said so directly, it would not have changed what she did. And watching her over 3 days, he believed her. She treated what was in front of her. She treated it correctly. She did not calculate the implications. He was an emperor. He spent his entire working life surrounded by people who were calculating the implications of every action relative to him. Reva was calculating the wound, and the breathing rate, and the poultice schedule. She was not calculating anything else. He found this remarkable. He found it, specifically, the most remarkable thing he had encountered in some time. On the morning of the 4th day, Mael flew. Not far, not high. He lifted from the valley floor and circled once at low altitude and landed. He landed near Reva, which was not where he had taken off from. He walked the remaining distance to the rock where she was sitting with the notebook, and stood next to her, and lowered his head. Reva said, "Good morning." Mael exhaled the long, low breath she had come to recognize as his version of acknowledgement. She looked at his wing attachment point, where the wound was. The poultice had done its work. The inflammation was resolved. The wound was closing cleanly. She wrote the final observation in the notebook and closed it. She said, to Mael, "You are going to be fine. The wing will need another 2 weeks of limited use before full flight, but you are going to be fine." She looked at the wing attachment point for a moment longer. She thought about what it would have looked like on the 5th day without intervention. She thought about what the 3rd notebook had said about bone-adjacent inflammation at the 48-hour point. She was very glad she had taken the long route. Sorin came across the valley from where he had been standing and watched Mael circle. He looked at what Reva had written in the notebook. He said, "The wing restriction, 2 weeks." She said, "Minimum. The muscle attachment needs the time." He said, "We will fly home slowly." She said, "That is the correct approach." He stood next to her for a moment. looking at Mael. Then he said, "I need to ask you something." She waited. He said, "Would you come to the palace? Not permanently, not as an official appointment, as a consultant on Mael's recovery." He paused. "And on other things." Reva said, "What other things?" He said, "The core physicians know dragon physiology from a bonded perspective. You know it from a direct treatment perspective. Those are different knowledges. Your grandmother's notebooks represent 40 years of fieldwork that the core archives do not have." He paused again. "And Mael would like you nearby." She looked at Mael. Mael was watching her with the amber eye. She said, "I need to make the Hearns Pass delivery first. There are people waiting on medicine." He said, "Of course, I will send an escort." She said, "I do not need an escort." He said, "Then I will send a message that you are coming, so the road is clear." She considered this. It was a practical offer. Without ceremony, she said, "That is acceptable." They left the valley on the 4th day, all 3 of them. Mael flew at low altitude with the careful wing beat of a healing animal taking no unnecessary strain. Sorin rode his horse on the path below, matching Mael's pace, keeping him in sight. Reva rode the mule with the medicine chest and the notebooks. They stopped at Hearns Pass first. The delivery was straightforward. The people at the settlement had been expecting Reva, and had questions, and she answered them, and administered the treatment that required administration, and gave instructions for the rest. While she was doing this, Sorin sat outside the settlement building and watched Mael resting on the hillside above. The bond channel, which had been stretched thin for 3 days, was returning to its normal quality. Closer, clearer. Mael was not fully recovered, but Mael was recovering, which was different from the alternative Sorin had been trying not to think about directly for 4 days. He thought about Reva inside the settlement building. He thought about her in the valley, the lantern and the notebook, and the 6 hours of careful sustained work, and the 3 days of monitoring, and the specific directness with which she had told him to sit down and eat something. He thought about the way Mael lowered his head to her level every morning now, the way the bond transmitted Mael's sense of her as known. Reva came out of the settlement building with the empty medicine chest and the strap over her shoulder. She said, "Ready." He said, "Was that everything they needed?" She said, "The winter supply situation is better than the last report suggested. They are well." She mounted the mule. She looked at Mael on the hillside, then at Sorin. She said, "I have questions about the bond. When we have time, I want to understand how the physical transmission works, from the inside. My grandmother's notebooks have the external observations, but not the experiential account." He said, "I will tell you everything I know about it." She said, "Good." They went north. Mael flew above them, slow and steady, his bronze scales catching the morning light. The bond channel carried what it always carried between them, the particular continuous presence of each other, the warmth of it, which Sorin had felt for 16 years and had almost lost 4 days ago, and which he was now conscious of in the specific way you become conscious of something after nearly losing it. He was also conscious, in a quieter and newer way, of the woman on the mule beside him who had saved it.